Thank you, Nancy, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to be speaking today. As Nancy said, I'm an energy and environmental stewardship educator, and I'm based down in southern Illinois and cover the southern 5 counties. I've been excited, though, to be speaking with all of you. As we get started, I just want to have a reminder that if you have questions during the presentation, feel free to either enter them into the chat box or you can save them until the end, and we'll address all of them at the end of the presentation. So to get started today, we're going to be talking about a group of plants that many people shy away from, which are the grasses. And I took an interest in identifying grasses while out hiking and realized that in many situations there are just 1 or 2 characteristics that very easily identify a grass. So today we're going to try to make identifying grasses at least a little bit easier. But before we get started talking about identifying grasses, we should start with what a grass is. So these plants are known as monocots, which is different than most of the plants that we're familiar with, like our flowering plants. Those are dicots. So what this means is that when grass seed begins to grow, they have 1 cotyledon, or 1 seed leaf that comes out of the ground. So typically you'll see 1 leaf coming out of the ground rather than 2. That's the normal for most of the plants that we're familiar with. And another characteristic that they have is they have parallel veins in their leaves. So if you've ever picked a blade of grass and looked at the way or the pattern of the veins in the leaves, you'll notice that they run parallel to one another. That's another way to tell that what you're looking at is a grass. Unfortunately, they do not have showy flowers, which is what makes them very tricky to identify. Here on the right, you can see a grass, and this grass is in flower right now, and it really doesn't look like anything spectacular, so it's not necessarily the best way to identify it. Grasses also have sheathing leaves, which means that the leaf blade will connect and hug the stem, and we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. And they also have jointed stems, so just like we have kneecaps and elbows, there's going to be nodes or joints along the stems of a grass, and that can help distinguish it from other groups of plants that look similar to it. So now that we know what a grass is, why are we talking about which is which? A lot of us may say, well, if I know it's a grass, that's good enough, because they're very difficult to distinguish. But we can probably know some benefits to telling the difference between other groups of plants that we have as well. So we probably have ideas of why we'd want to tell which trees we have in our yards apart from one another, and grasses are the same way. So just like any group of plants or organisms, grasses are highly diverse. That means there's lots and lots of different types of them. Here in Illinois, we have just over 330 different types of grasses. Now, we're not going to cover nearly all of them today, but that just shows you that if we have that perception that there's just a few grasses out there, there really is a lot more than you might initially think. Okay, and if we have a lot more diversity of grasses, that helps keep our ecosystems, the places, our natural areas, healthier. Another benefit to knowing which grass is which is that we can tell which grasses are native and which are non-native. And this can help us if we're trying to manage for an invasive or a non-native grass. So here in this picture below, you can see a whole field full of smooth brome, which is a non-native grass. There are other non-native invasives like Japanese stiltgrass down in southern Illinois, and if we weren't able to identify that grass, then we wouldn't be able to properly treat for that grass. So it's really important to know what we're looking at so that we can keep healthy ecosystems. But again, many of the characteristics that make a grass also play a part in making them tricky to identify. So often when trying to identify a plant, most of us are excited if we can find a showy, colorful flower. And many of our ID guides are organized by flower color, but grasses don't have those showy flowers. So we already don't have that helpful clue. Often if we see just a tuft of leaves and stems, like in this picture here, they all look really similar among different species to the untrained eye. So today we're going to learn some easy characteristics to look for on those leaves and stems, but still just starting out, it can be a little bit intimidating. And often trained botanists use really tiny characteristics that you need a microscope for to differentiate the grasses. So again, that poses another barrier to people like you and me going out and identifying grasses and knowing what we're looking at. But again, we're not going to get too far in depth with that. Everything that we're going to be looking at today, you should be able to see with the naked eye or with the help of just a small microscope, just to see things a little bit clearer. So to go ahead and discuss our approach, we're going to be looking for those really simple yet distinct characteristics in leaves and then also in inflorescences. And that's just a word that refers to the flowering structure of a grass. And we're going to go through some terms as well before we really get into identifying grasses. But a first step, a good place to start, is to look at where that grass is growing. So sometimes we overlook the importance of habitat in identifying a grass, but it can be a very helpful distinguishing feature. So if the grass is in a lawn, that already narrows down the potential possibilities of what it could be. Or if we're on a hike and we see a grass out in a natural area, if we can differentiate between an open area with full sun and a shaded, more wooded area, that can also be a really important clue in telling us if what type of grass we're looking at. Okay, so once we figure out where a grass is growing, we're going to start with habitat. Then we can look and see if we have an inflorescence, or that flowering part of the plant. If we do, that's a great place to start, because again, it's easier to use characteristics of that part of the grass rather than starting with the leaves and the stems that look really similar across all of the different species. So in this picture here on the left, you can see an inflorescence of Indian grass, and right here on some of these seeds you can see these little projections or bristles. Those are called awns, and we'll talk about those later today as well, and those are a useful characteristic for identifying a grass. You can also see it's very, very golden in color with these yellow parts also present. And those three characteristics together tell me that this is Indian grass. Okay, so we're going to go through a bunch of grasses today, but recognizing those three main key characteristics is enough for me to tell that this grass is Indian grass. Okay, if we had to start over here with just the leaves, we'd have to look at some different characteristics, and it might be a little bit trickier than starting with this part of the grass. Okay, so before we go any further, we're going to cover some terms, and this is a great slide to refer back to, this one and the next one, just if you get lost with this terminology, but we're going to try to keep it really simple. So if we look at this diagram on the left over here, you'll see a simple grass, stem and leaf. So you can clearly see the stem is here, and then the leaf consists of two parts. So we typically think of a leaf as this part right here, which is called the blade. That's the part that emerges from the stem, okay? That's the leaf blade. And then leaves and grasses, like we talked about already, they sheathe or they cover the stem. So that leaf blade is going to come down and then it's going to wrap around this stem. And that part where it's wrapped around the stem is called the sheath, okay? So a leaf has a blade and a sheath. The point on the stem right here where that sheath ends is a node, and that's that swollen joint like your kneecap or your elbow, okay, on the grass. So again, we have a stem, a blade that becomes the sheath and joins at the node. Okay, those are the general parts of the grass leaves and stems. And then a really great place to look on a grass to help identify it is this part right here. This is called the collar region, which you don't have to remember that term after I said it this one time, but that part where the leaf blade joins the stem to become the sheath, that's a very important place to look. And you can see different diagrams and pictures of what that part looks like on the right side of the slide here. So if we took this piece and turned it to our right so it's facing us, you would get different pictures that look like these over here. Okay? So again, this would be the leaf blade, and here the leaf sheath. They took out the stem, which would run right here. And often what you find in this part of a grass is something called a ligule, which is right here. And we'll talk about ligules a bunch during this presentation, so that's a good term to remember. Ligules can come in different shapes and sizes, and you can see a diagram of 4 examples down here below. So we have 4 different examples of different types of ligules. So on the left here, there is no ligule on this grass. And often, grasses do have some type of ligule. So if they don't, that's a great characteristic to notice. In this second picture, you can see a fringe of hairs. So the ligule can be hairy. In the next picture, we can see that there's a membrane. So like a piece of tissue, that would be another example of a ligule. And then if we move to the final diagram, you can see a very tall membranous ligule. So again, 4 different examples of ligules that all will help identify what grass we're looking at. Another good identifying feature to notice that often is not present, so when you find it, it's like a golden ticket. It really helps narrow down what you're looking at. Those are called auricles that you can see here, and they're basically like little arms that come and hug the stem. You can see another example right here of those auricles or arms. So a good way to see if you have arms is to pull the leaf blade back from the stem, and that will really help you see if there are arms present or not. Again, like I said, in most cases those are not there, but if they are, then that's really a great sign to see. Okay, now that we've looked at diagrams, let's look on an actual grass and see if we can identify and label these parts. We'll start with the leaf blade. Okay, again, that is the part of the grass that we typically think of as the leaf. Next we have the ligule, and you can see in this grass there is a short membranous ligule, that very clear piece of tissue right there. And again, this is where having a small microscope or a hand lens could be helpful. But again, these are things that I'm able to very clearly see with the naked eye. Next we have the stem, which is also called the comb. I won't use that term again, but again we have that stem here, or a comb. And then finally we have the leaf sheath. So you can see here what I did is I pulled the blade back from the stem. That pulls that sheath off and really exposes that ligule. So that's a good practice to do when you're out in the field and you're trying to look for these different plant parts, is to pull a leaf blade back from the stem and look and see what you can find in that part right here that used to hug the stem. Okay, the next thing that we need to look at is the different types of inflorescences. And again, this looks like a lot of terms and a lot of diagrams on this page, but I'm going to simplify it for you. So the inflorescence is, again, that collection, arrangement of flowers that we have. And on a grass, I typically refer to it as the flowers and the seeds. And the collective term we use for that is a spikelet. So you'll hear me say the term spikelet a lot, and that refers to, again, the flowers and the seeds. So there's 3 main types of inflorescences or arrangements of those spikelets that can help us tell what grass we're looking at. So the first one is a spike, and you can see here some drawings of what a spike in a inflorescence looks like here. It basically means that all of those flowers are directly attached to the main stem. So here's an example of giant foxtail, which has a spike. So again, you can see how all of those seeds are attached directly to the stem. Our next inflorescence type is a raceme. And this one I like to think of as looking like fingers. So you have these spikelets arranged on little finger projections that come off that main stem. Okay? And a good example of that is big blue stem. So again, here you can see that we have different fingers that all contain those flowering parts separately. Okay? This right here is again a raceme. And our last one is a panicle, which means that we have a very large open branching arrangement of the flowers. You can see that in those diagrams present there. And again, an example in a picture, this is switchgrass here, and grasses with panicles are very hard to photograph because they're open and airy, but you can see there's a panicle right here and one right here. These basically mean that there's lots of branching and those seeds, those flowering parts, are more spread out throughout that inflorescence. Okay, so our three main inflorescence types, again, a spike, a raceme, and a panicle. Okay, so now we're going to start putting these terms and this knowledge to use. So the first thing we're going to do is try to identify some common lawn grasses. Now if you look on the right, I have some pictures of different types of lawn grasses, and if I took those labels away, it would be very difficult to tell what we're looking at. Again, just looking at these pictures, all I see is a whole bunch of green leaves. But we're going to try to dive into that and find a few characteristics that can help us identify different lawn types. A good suggestion for identifying lawn grasses is to let a little patch of your lawn grow up so that the grass is allowed to flower and put out that inflorescence. That's going to be a really great clue that allows us to have some more characteristics to look at to make sure that what we're identifying is accurate. So let's get started with the lawn grasses. The first one is Kentucky bluegrass, and one of the easiest things to look for on this lawn grass is the tips of the leaf blades. This grass and some other bluegrasses have what's called a keeled tip, which means that it's boat-shaped, and we can see that here in this picture. And if we held this leaf to a different angle, we'd see that the tip right here is shaped like a canoe or the tip of a boat. That's a very, very distinctive feature. Most grass leaf tips, are flat all the way to the point. But in Kentucky bluegrass, it curves up slightly at the end. So if you see that characteristic, then you are looking at either Kentucky bluegrass or a couple others that I'll talk about in a few seconds. So again, Kentucky bluegrass also has a round stem. So there's another bluegrass called Canada bluegrass, and it has a flat stem. So an easy way to tell them apart is to try to roll that stem between your fingers. If it rolls, then it's most likely Kentucky. But if it's flat, then you definitely have Canada bluegrass. Another bluegrass that we have is annual bluegrass, and it looks very similar to Kentucky, but it's much lighter green in color. So if you have a rich, dark green, a deep, bright green, that's going to be Kentucky bluegrass. But if it's a little bit lighter, more lime-colored, then you probably have annual bluegrass. But again, looking for that boat-shaped tip is going to clue you in that you are looking at one of the bluegrasses. And just for reference on the right, we have a picture right here. I think many of us are familiar with the species, but this is what that flowering part, that inflorescence looks like, and we can see that it is a panicle. Okay, our next turf grass or long grass that we'll look at is tall fescue. This one we can already probably see some differences from our last slide, from that Kentucky bluegrass. In this grass we have much wider and thicker leaves that you can see in the leftmost picture. And a really great characteristic that this grass has is those auricles, or those arms. And again, I don't have a specific picture showing that, but if you look very close, you may be able to see right in this area there are these white little arms that are hugging the stem. And again, I apologize for not having a picture showing distinctly that part. But if you were able to pull that blade back from the stem, you definitely see those auricles. And that's a great clue that what you're looking at is tall fescue. Again, we can see on the right a picture of the inflorescence here, and then a close-up of some of those spikelets. And you can see again that they're very different than the Kentucky bluegrass, and they are arranged in a spike rather than a panicle. So again, another clue for you to note. All right, creeping bentgrass is our next grass. And this grass can be identified because it has a tall membranous ligule. Again, on this grass here, and it's not showing up as well as it did before on this picture, but there is a ligule right here that would be noticeable if you were in the field and you were able to pull that leaf blade back. Just like the name suggests, this grass spreads by creeping, so that's another good place to look for a characteristic, and it will put up purplish panicles when it is flowering. So again, this one, it will not have those boat-shaped tips, and it's not going to have those auricles like the tall fescue. Okay, we're halfway through the lawn grasses we're going to look at. So our next one is Perennial Ryegrass. This one, again, is going to have thinner, finer leaf blades like our Kentucky bluegrass, but they're not going to have that keel. Again, they're sharp-pointed. This one also has a membranous ligule, but it's much shorter than our creeping bentgrass, our last grass that we looked at. And again, this one grows in clumps, and so it's different than that creeping bentgrass that's going to grow by creeping. Okay, Zoysia grass is one of the easiest ones to identify in the fall or the winter time because this turf grass goes dormant, and so it turns yellow. So it's very distinctive. It's not one of those grasses that stays green year-round, so very easy to identify in the fall or in the winter, and even the early spring because it does take a while to green up again. But if you were in the summertime and you wanted to identify it, it has a fringe of hairs at the ligule, which you can see in this top picture here. There are these long hairs right where that leaf blade joins the stem. And so that can be another clue for you to look at if you're not able to look at this lawn grass in the dormant season. But again, if you think it's Zoysia, then wait until the fall time and see if it goes dormant and turns yellow. Okay, our final turf grass that we'll look at today, again, there was a whole bunch of them, and I just wanted to choose just a few to cover to try to distinguish. Our last one is Bermuda grass, and this one spreads both above and below ground and is very difficult to eradicate. So I can tell by this growth form in this picture down here that it's Bermuda grass by those clumps and then all of those runners that you can see. Again, you can see on the top right picture that it has raceme inflorescence, which means it's those finger-like projections. So those things together clue me in that it might be Bermuda grass. Okay, so now that we've looked at turf grasses, just to review those top characteristics, we had Kentucky bluegrass with that keeled, boat-shaped tip. Bermuda grass has that raceme finger-like flowering part. Tall fescue has auricles. Zoysia is yellow in the fall and has a hairy ligule. Creeping bentgrass has a tall membranous ligule. and Perennial Ryegrass has a short ligule. So again, you can see among those 6 different grasses, each of them has at least one characteristic that kind of clues us in, or at least brings us closer to identifying that that's the grass we're looking at. So again, even if we're not able to get to that final identification, we're able to eliminate a whole bunch of other options just by picking out some of those characteristics. So again, a very good place to start. But now we're going to transition a little bit to look at other grasses that we have in Illinois that you may see when you're out on a hike in the woods or in a grassland, or if there's an unmowed area, a pasture that you have nearby home. So we'll start with some common groups of grasses that you may see. We'll talk about 9 different groups, and then we'll move into just a few other specific ones that didn't fit into those general groups, but are still pretty common throughout the state and relatively easy to identify. Okay, so our first general group of grasses that we'll talk about are the bromes, and I do have pictures on a future slide, so don't think I just left off a picture on this one. The bromes are perennial grasses, so they come back year after year, and they're cool season, which means that they're going to flower earlier in the spring. So they'll green up and flower earlier in the year. Most of the bromes that we have in Illinois are introduced species, so they are non-native. Some have become invasive, but not all of them. And they have 2 main distinguishing features. So those spikelets, or those flowering parts of the plants, most of them have awns. Okay, and we saw an awn in a previous slide, but we'll show that feature again. And they also have short membranous ligules. Okay, so those 2 characteristics usually clue us in that we're looking at a brome. Unfortunately, the first example I chose of a brome does not have those characteristic awns. However, it does have a short membranous ligule, which you can see right here in this photo. Okay? But the way that I identify smooth brome is actually with a leaf characteristic. So this is a grass that if you run your fingers from the bottom to the top of the leaf blade, you'll feel an M-shaped crimp on the leaves. And I tried to capture it in this photo down here with the sunlight in the background. You can sort of see an M-shaped crimp, but it's definitely very apparent when you are able to feel that grass. Once I feel that crimp on the leaves, I know it's smooth brome. There's only one other grass that I know of that has that crimp, and it's very robust and it grows in different areas, and we'll talk about it later. It's Phragmites, also sometimes has an M-shaped crimp. But again, this grass, which grows typically about 4 feet tall, that characteristic right away clues me into what I'm looking at. Other things to look for: in the summertime, those leaves are going to start to die because it's a cool season grass, and they characteristically curl around the stem, and they have a very distinctive sound, a very distinctive rustle in the wind that if you're in a big patch of it, you'll be able to point out and hear. Again, you can see that it has a panicle in this photo here, and those spikelets or those seeds are very elongated and smooth. So if you put all of those characteristics together, you're definitely looking at smooth brome. But if you feel that M-shaped crimp, that's a very easy, very quick clue to check and see. Another brome that we have is cheatgrass, and this grass has those long characteristic awns of the bromes, which you can see in this photo here. Those are those bristles or extra projections that come out of the spikelets. You can see them in this picture here, how bushy it makes the grass look. Okay, and this grass also always has a drooping inflorescence. So instead of being held straight upright, it droops, and then that plus those awns means you're looking at cheatgrass. This grass is an invasive species, and it's doing quite a bit of damage here in Illinois, but also out west in more of our arid grasslands. So this one is definitely one to be on the lookout for, and try to get it out as soon as you can. Okay, our second group of plants that we'll look at are the panic grasses. These are kind of difficult to distinguish among each other. So there are 33 different panic grasses in Illinois, but as a group, they're pretty easy to identify. So some good characteristics to look for is their panicle inflorescence that you can hopefully see in this photo here and in this photo here, although it's a little bit hard in this photo. And their spikelets or their flowering parts are very round, okay? And so you can see it looks like tiny little round balls all along that panicle. These grasses flower twice, so you'll see them flower and put an inflorescence out on the tip of the plant in early spring, and then they'll flower again in the summertime, and those inflorescences or those flowering clusters come out from the branches of the plant, so along the leaves. So interesting plant. If you see it flower twice throughout the summertime, that might be a good clue that you're looking at a panic grass. They also, again, some of them are very hairy, some of them aren't. That would get into differentiating which species you're looking at. But as a general group, overall, if you see a panicle inflorescence with very round seeds that flowers twice throughout the season, that's a good clue that you're looking at a panic grass. Okay, our third group, one that we're probably also familiar with, are the crabgrasses. These are one of the grasses that have a raceme inflorescence, which again is that finger-like arrangement of the spikelets. They are annual, and they're often found in our lawns. That's where we're most familiar with them. So again, this is where taking into consideration the habitat of the grass that you're looking at becomes very important. There are two main types of crabgrasses, common and smooth, and the easiest way to tell them apart is that smooth does not have hairs and common does. Okay, and you can see it's identifying the hairy parts as the leaf sheaths. Okay, so again, that's the part of the grass where the leaf comes and hugs the stem. That's the part where you're going to look for if there are hairs or if there aren't hairs. If there are, then it's common. If there aren't, then it's smooth. So that's a pretty easy characteristic to distinguish between the two crabgrasses. Okay, next are the barnyard grasses. These also have a raceme inflorescence, although it kind of looks more like a panicle. But you can see how different shaped it is from our last group. This grass is also much more robust, so it can grow up to 4 to 5 feet tall. And it has two different subspecies. So one of them, the spikelets have awns, again, that this arrow is pointing to. Those are those bristle-like projections. That's a great characteristic. If you see those, it very easily helps identify a grass. But there is also a type of barnyard grass that does not have those awns. So if you find one that doesn't have the awns, how do you tell it's a barnyard grass? Well, a good clue is that it does not have a ligule. So I think almost all of the grasses we've talked about so far have had some type of ligule that we've noted, but this one very prominently does not have a ligule. So if you pulled that leaf blade back, what you would see is just a smooth part of the plant. You wouldn't see any membranes or hairs present there. It also has a prominent midrib on the leaves that you can see here. That also would be a good characteristic to look for. The combination of that without a ligule could help clue you in that you're looking at a barnyard grass. Okay, next are the Ryes. These are some of my favorite to identify because once you have an inflorescence, they're very easy to tell what you're looking at. So as a group, in general, they have wide, weak, shiny leaves that really don't clue you into what you're looking at. But again, the structure of the inflorescence, which all of them have a spike, but how that spike is held, if it's held up or if it droops down, and then how the awns are arranged help tell you which species you're looking at. So because I like this group so much, I gave you 3 examples here. So the first one is Canada wild rye, and that's the one that's pictured up in this photo here. And you can see that that spike droops. So we can see the stem and then the spike droops down. So that's our first clue that it's Canada wild rye. But our second clue is that it has awns that curve outwards. Okay, so each awn is curved. None of them are held straight out or straight up. They're all curved. So if you put those 2 characteristics together, you're looking at Canada wild rye. Our next example is Virginia wild rye, which is in this photo here. And here we can see that that spike is held up, but sometimes it can droop as well. But a good characteristic to then look for is that all of the awns, you might not even be able to see them because they're all held straight up. Okay, so in this case, we do not have curved awns. We have straight awns. So whether this spike is drooping or it's held up straight, we still have straight awns that tells us it's Virginia wild rye. And then our final rye that we'll look at is bottlebrush grass, which is down here, and this is the easiest one to identify because that spike just looks like a bottle brush. So again, the spike can either be held straight up or it can droop like this one is here. And those awns are held out 90 degrees from that stem. So if you put those 2 characteristics together and the fact that it looks like a bottle brush, that will clue you in that that's the grass you're looking at, bottlebrush grass. So again, 3 examples to show you just differentiating between those 2 characteristics can help you narrow down which type of ryegrass you're looking at. Okay, the Lovegrasses are next. These are bunch grasses, and some characteristics that they have are they have glands on that leaf sheath and on the inflorescences. So we haven't talked about glands yet, but basically what you'll see is just a circular, clear dot. And these, you might need a microscope to really be able to see the glands on this grass. But they have very open panicles as well that can help you distinguish the lovegrasses. And I have 2 examples here. Purple lovegrass, very easy to identify based on the color. You can see that very bright pinkish to purple color. And the inflorescences are panicles. Okay, so that open branching pattern, and in this grass they're very large. They are at least a foot to a foot and a half in size, and they almost overwhelm and dwarf any of the leaf material that's been put out by this plant, which is rather delicate because those inflorescences are just so large. So if you see a huge collection of just open, airy purple, that's going to be purple lovegrass. We also have stink grass in this group, which is aptly named because the leaves have an odor. So when I'm out in the field, I like to always be seeing if anything has a scent, making sure I'm careful what I'm picking, but if I'm looking at grasses, I should be okay. If I'm able to pull off a leaf and smell it, if it has an odor, that's a great clue starting out that it's stink grass. Again, this one can be identified by those glands, so if you do have a microscope or a hand lens with you, you can look at that. And they also do have a large panicle of spikelets. Okay, our next group of grasses are the panicums, and I just started right off with an example in this case. So here we have switchgrass, which is a common prairie species. This is a bunch grass, which you can see in this diagram here, its growth form. And its leaves have a very prominent midrib that you can see here. But the easiest way to identify it, the characteristic that I look for, whether it's flowering, it has its inflorescence or not, is that it has hairs where the leaf blade joins the stem, and those hairs are arranged in a triangle pattern. And it's difficult to tell in pictures, but again, here you can see those hairs, and I tried to outline it here to show that there is a denser collection of hairs in the shape of a triangle. There are other hairs along the leaf, but that's not necessarily the best characteristic to go by because hairs along leaves in general are pretty variable among different grasses, but this dense tuft of a triangle-shaped tuft of hairs is very distinctive, and the only grass that I know that it occurs in is switchgrass. Again, this is the grass that we showed earlier that has those open panicles, and those spikelets are a reddish color as well, so that's another clue that it's switchgrass if you're not able to see those hairs. Because unfortunately over time, as the season progresses, a lot of grasses will lose some of their hairiness. So again, that's a very good clue early in the season, but if it is flowering and you can use that panicle as a clue, that's going to, again, help back you up even if you don't see that triangle of hairs. Another example in the panicum group is witchgrass. And this grass is an annual, and it has leaf sheaths with very, very long spreading hairs. And again, you can kind of see them in this photo here, all of the bristly hairs along the stem and on the sheath there. They do have short hairy ligules as well, so it's a very hairy plant. And then very large open airy panicles that you can see here. To me, it looks like a witch's broom. So if you can remember witchgrass, witch's broom, and then the panicle, that's a good clue. Again, this panicle will be very large, so at least a foot tall and very, very dense with all of those branches and all of the tiny spikelets on it. Okay, the foxtails are next, and this group is one that I always found tricky to identify when I first started looking at grasses, but now I know a couple clues that make it very, very easy to tell them apart. So there are three main species, and we have giant foxtail, which you can see down in this diagram here on the left. This one you can clearly see has a very long drooping spike, and it's much larger than either green or yellow foxtail. So right away, giant foxtail is true to its name, much larger, curving spike. So that already takes out that foxtail. But then we have green and yellow, and you might say, looking at these two pictures, that they look very similar. And I would agree with you. And one thing that I'd urge you not to do is go by color, because I have seen green-colored yellow foxtail and yellow-colored green foxtail. So unfortunately, the color isn't really a great help in this case. But there are two different things that you can look at. And if we switch to this diagram on the left here, we can see a difference in their ligules. So if we start with green foxtail, we can see that it has short, hairy ligule. And yellow foxtail has very long, spreading hairs that are very clearly different than that green foxtail with just those short hairs present. So if you see those long hairs, you've got yellow foxtail. If it's very short, it's going to be green foxtail. Another thing that you can do is along the spike, each little seed that's attached to that spike has bristles coming out from under it. You can see them here. And the number of bristles underneath each seed differs between green and yellow foxtail. So you might be thinking that we're getting really detailed here, but this is a great identifying feature if you don't have any leaves that are intact left on the stem. So what you do is just pluck off a seed and then see how many bristles come with it. And if there's just 1 to 3 bristles, so a very low number, then you have green foxtail. But if there's many more, usually 5 to 15 or even more, then it's going to be yellow foxtail. So just knowing those two things, the hairiness of that ligule and the number of bristles, can help you distinguish between green and yellow foxtail. And then we know giant foxtail because it looks so much different and is much more robust than the other two. Okay, the last general group that we'll look at are the drop seeds, and these aren't really remarkable in appearance. They have much thinner leaves than a lot of the other grasses that we looked at. You can see that in this photo here and in this photo here, much thinner leaves. And then their panicles are pretty narrow as well. So you can see tall drop seed, it has this spike-like panicle that actually stays somewhat inside of the stem, even when it's flowering. So very, very not showy of an inflorescence. And again, those very thin leaves. And then the prairie drop seed does put out a pyramidal panicle, so it does have a little panicle, but again, very nondescript, very small, not really that remarkable. So again, a good clue to start with is just how thin those leaves are. That's a great place to start looking at the drop seeds. Okay, so we've covered now our lawn grasses, 6 lawn grasses, and 9 other groups of grasses that are common throughout Illinois. But like I mentioned earlier, there are a few others that didn't fit into those groups that are very common that I wanted to point out. So we're just going to go through those individually and point out some of their key identifying features. So to get started, we'll start with little bluestem. This is probably my favorite grass, and yes, I have a favorite grass. This grass is very typical of the prairies, and it only grows in higher quality prairie habitat. And that's an important thing to note because there's another grass that looks very similar to little bluestem that we'll talk about on the next slide, but it grows in poorer quality habitats. So back to little bluestem, it does grow in bunches. So this right here, you can see that it's growing in a bunch. And the easiest way that I can tell little bluestem is when it has its spikelets because they look like white fluffy little eyelashes. And you can see them arranged here. And you can see that they're relatively small in comparison to my hand here. And they're relatively sparse. So it's not a huge dense tuft of these white fluffy spikelets, but they're pretty sparsely arranged along that inflorescence there. Another thing to note is with grasses that are often called blue, what we mean is that they're red. So not to make it confusing, but often if something is called a blue stem, it often has reddish stems. And you can kind of see that in this photo here. Some of these stems look really reddish. In the fall, this grass will turn an orangey golden color, and it's a really, really pretty grass to have in your garden, actually. Okay, so the look-alike to little bluestem is broom sedge. But again, broom sedge is going to grow in more disturbed habitats or more frequently mowed habitats or pastures, and I often see it covering roadsides. So if you see something and you can't decide if it's broom sedge or if it's little bluestem, look at the habitat that you're in, and if there's quite a bit of it around and you're not standing in a prairie, it's most likely broom sedge. But this one is much leafier than little bluestem. So it's a much more robust, denser bunch grass. It will turn golden orange in the fall. And another thing that you can see here is that its spikelets are also very fluffy, but you can see how long and large they are in comparison to our last spikelets, which were very small and delicate and a more white in color, whereas in broom sedge they are creamier in color. So again, to go backwards just quickly for a comparison, we see these small white spikelets, and then in broom sedge these much larger, creamier, denser, hairy spikelets. Okay, our next grass is side oats grama, and this is another prairie grass. It can grow about a couple feet tall, and one of the characteristics that I love about this grass is that it has hairs along the margins, which is the edge of the leaf, that you can see in this photo here. Again, very, very few grasses are going to have this arrangement of hairs, and typically you will only find them towards the base of the leaf blade. So here we can see this is the sheath here, and this is the base, and those hairs will wear off as you look towards the tip. But again, you can see these evenly spaced hairs that are only on the outside or that edge of the leaf. And you can actually maybe see here that there are little circles where they join, and that's a gland that they're on. But again, you don't need to see that characteristic to notice those hairs on the edges. Also, the arrangement of the spikelets causes the stem to zigzag where they're attached. And you can see that here, that stem zigzags. And often this grass, later in the season, when it starts to dry out, will bend over and the spikelets hang off just one side of the stem, which you can see here in this picture. Again, as it starts early in the season, it'll be held straight up, but later in the season, it'll bend over and hold all of those spikelets to one side, which is where it gets that name side oats, Grandma. Okay, our next grass is red top, and this grass is a Kentucky bluegrass look-alike. And I like to point it out because when I learned to identify this grass, I misidentified it as Kentucky bluegrass for a long time. But now that I know that Kentucky bluegrass has that keeled tip, I shouldn't have made this mistake because red top does not. It just has a pointed tip. But the way I identify red top is because it has a very, very tall membranous ligule. And you can see that in this picture here. So again, if you're able to pull that leaf blade back and look for that ligule, it's a great telltale sign if you're trying to determine between Kentucky bluegrass and red top. You can see that it has a panicle inflorescence here. And this is what the inflorescence looks like before it opens. So it can be a dense, it looks like a spike, it looks like a dense arrangement of all of those flowering parts, but then it opens and becomes a panicle. But you can really see that brownish red color before it fully opens. But again, you can still see that when it's open as a full panicle, that red color, which is another great characteristic. In this case, that color is going to help you tell that you're looking at red top. Okay, one of my favorite grasses is Indian grass, and this grass is really cool because it has a blue hue to it. And so while it might look very green to you, if you're out looking in a prairie or a grassland, that's where this one's going to be growing, and you see a grass that just looks a little bit grayer, the green is grayer or a little bit blue, that's a very good clue that you're looking at Indian grass. The leaves on this grass, have a very prominent midrib that's white that you can see in this photo here. Very strong white midrib. But the characteristic that I look for is something called horns or shoulders. So again, if you do what we've been talking about and you pull that leaf blade back, here where those arrows are pointing, you should see these two little projections on either side of the ligule. And those are called horns or shoulders. And again, none of the grasses that we've talked about today or will talk about today have those pointed projections. So very good clue along with that blue color and that midrib that you're looking at Indian grass. Again, if you're able to catch it when it has its inflorescence, you can see that it's very golden orange. And it is very silky smooth as well. So if you're able to run your hands down along that inflorescence, you'll feel that it's a very silky grass. On the inflorescence, but not on the leaves, just to clarify. Okay, purple top is another grass that has purple inflorescence, like that purple lovegrass. Okay, but in this case, it's very easy to distinguish because if you run your hand along that inflorescence again, just like I mentioned in Indian grass, this grass is going to leave like an oily texture on your hand. And that's how I identify purple top. The color, that light open inflorescence that you can see in this right-hand picture, and that oiliness right away tells me that I'm looking at purple top. But if you didn't have that inflorescence, things you could look for are dense velvety hairs in a whole bunch of different spots on this grass. So they have them on the back side of the leaf sheath, so the back side of where the blade joins the stem and becomes the sheath. There's velvety hairs. There's velvety nodes over here as well. And then you can also see some hairs that are present in the ligule. Okay, so all of those together help clue me in that I'm looking at purple top. Okay, big blue stem is next, and we just have a few left. So big blue stem is the state grass of Illinois, very typical prairie grass. This is the one that if you know prairies, you know big blue stem. So again, this is a bunch grass that is very robust. It can grow 8 to 10 to 12 feet tall depending on where in the state you're at. The leaves that are growing towards the base of the grass can be a little bit red in color, red-blue as we like to say, but what really looks red on this grass is the culms or the stems. So you can see that in this picture here, that very red stem, and in this photo as well. Sometimes the leaf sheath can have some sparse hairs that you can see here, and it does have a membranous ligule, again, that we can point out. But how I identify this grass is when it has its raceme inflorescence. It looks like a turkey foot. And so some people do call this grass turkey foot. So you can see that shape right here, very characteristic. It doesn't always just have 3 different branches or fingers in its raceme, as you can see in the picture on the right over here. But definitely very characteristic of a turkey foot. They will branch with age and kind of curve and rustle in the wind. So again, easy way to tell big blue stem is to look for that shape of the inflorescence. Okay, common reed is our next grass, which can also, we mostly probably recognize it by the name Phragmites. This is a grass that we're probably really familiar with because it's growing all over our roadsides, especially in wet areas. And this is a very, very robust grass. Grows at least 10 feet tall, but sometimes much taller than that in wet areas. Again, this is the one that I mentioned earlier when we talked about smooth brome that may have an M-shaped crimp in the leaves. I've been out identifying grasses and noticed a crimp in the leaves and couldn't quite figure out what I was looking at until I took into account the habitat, so the wetness of the area, and the robustness of the grass. And then I realized I was looking at Phragmites and learned that it puts out an M-shaped crimp sometimes, just like smooth brome. But it will also produce this very large panicle that is purplish in color and then dries and rustles in the wind in the wintertime. If you need another identifying feature, the ligule has a fringe of hairs that you can see very clearly in this photo here. So if you pull that leaf blade back, you should be able to see those hairs. Okay, orchard grass is another common pasture grass that you'll see. It has a tall membranous ligule, which is a good clue, but another really unique feature of this grass is that it has a keeled sheath and leaf blade. And in this case, that keeled word refers to the fact that it looks like the sheath and the blade were folded and then didn't quite open all the way back. So you can see a very distinct folded line along the back of the leaf sheath and underneath the blade. Again, a different arrangement here of the spikelets. They're arranged in these clusters here, and that's something different that we haven't seen in any of the other grasses either today. Okay, and the last grass that we'll look at today is Johnson grass. This is a non-native grass that's invasive in some areas in the state. Very large, robust grass. It has velvety hairs in its ligule, so you would see those here. It has a prominent white midrib that you can see in the background of this picture, but as the season progresses, it turns this reddish color, and it really just starts to look not very healthy as the season progresses. It does put out a spreading panicle with reddish spikelets, and it has very sharp leaves. So I'm not recommending that you go out and test for this, but if you're out by a patch of grass and you rub up against it and it's very sharp, that's a clue that it could be Johnson grass. Now, a lot of our native prairie grasses also have sharp leaves, but this one also is a clue that that's what you could be looking at. Okay, so to review again, when starting to identify a grass, I know I've given you a whole bunch of information today and a whole lot of examples, but a good place to start is with that inflorescence, so that flowering part of the grass. And if that's not present, then we're going to move to some leaf characteristics. Other things to keep in mind is not to forget the habitat of where we're looking at that grass. Is it growing in a lawn? Is it growing in a wooded area? Or is it growing in a sunny area? How large is the grass? Is it a really robust grass? Or is it a smaller, more delicate grass? Does it have any hairs? We looked at ligules a whole bunch today. Is there a hairy ligule? Is there a membranous ligule? Is there no ligule? And then you can also look for any distinct colors. So we talked about that bluish hint in the Indian grass of the leaves, and then we talked about red stems in our blue stems. So again, those are all clues that you can look for that help narrow down what grass you're looking at. Okay, so with that, I want to thank you all for being here today. Here is my contact information. If you did have any questions, feel free to reach out. The easiest way to reach me is through my email that's on the bottom there. And again, we will be posting this recording on our YouTube page, where you can also see previous recordings of other Four Seasons webinars. And I will move to our last slide, which has a QR code that we encourage you to scan to take a brief survey after listening in today to this webinar. And Nancy will go ahead and post that in the chat box as well. And as she's doing that, I want to thank you again, and we'll be able to take questions. So if there were any questions that came in, Nancy can share those with me now, or if there are questions that you have and want to type into the chat box, you can do that. You can do that as well.
Thank you, Erin. This is Nancy, and we did have a couple questions come in. So the first one was, could you help with the difference between Johnson grass and gamma grass when no inflorescence?
Yes, okay. So Johnson grass we talked about. Gamma grass we didn't mention today, but it does look very similar. And this is one that I actually took a long time trying to figure out how to tell the difference. So gamma grass has a very interesting growth form. So often it's it's a bunch grass. So you'll usually find a big circle where it's growing. And as the season progresses, it often looks like a deer came and sat down in the middle of that bunch and compressed all of those leaves out, but that's just the natural growth form. And Johnson grass isn't going to do that. So if you see that very round, distinct growth pattern with matted down vegetation in the center, it's gamma grass. If you don't, then it's going to be more likely to be Johnson grass. Again, because we really like gamma grass but don't really like Johnson grass, I'd make sure to look for that inflorescence before you treat for Johnson grass. But again, gamma grass also has very sharp leaves, just like Johnson grass, so that doesn't help you with that characteristic. But the easiest way I tell is to look for that growth form.
Thank you, Erin. We did have a second question come in, and that is, what is the inflorescence type for Zoysia grass?
That is a great question, and I do not know off the top of my head. I typically only ever look for that yellow color and the ligule. So, and I didn't put a picture in this presentation, so unfortunately I don't have that off the top of my head.
So what I would recommend on that is if you wanted to email and follow up with Erin, I'm sure she'd be happy to do some research. I will try to pull up some information while we address our last question that came in, which is what is the best way to get rid of unwanted prairie grasses in flower beds? And this person is thinking she has quake and bush grass.
Okay, that is not a grass I have heard of before. I'm not familiar with that one. And the best way to get rid of it, again, I would have to look up management recommendations for you and get back with you if you wanted to email me on that, because I'm not sure off the top of my head the best way to get rid of those types of grasses. Again, once you plant a prairie grass, unfortunately, in your flower bed, they can be difficult to eradicate because they do put down very deep roots. But again, we can touch base with that and get some more information.
Okay, and I suggest, I am definitely no grass expert. This is Nancy speaking. So I do suggest following up with Erin as far as the Zoysia grass and quake and bush grass that wasn't coming up in a quick search. But it looked like the Zoysia grass had a single inflorescent, like a spikelet. But please follow up with Erin on that one. And I mean, this is great comments in the chat box saying, love the way you presented. And I just posted a live link to complete the evaluation for this program. And you could also scan that QR code that is on your screen if you have a mobile device, and that will take you to a survey questionnaire as well.